I've got an idea for you that you probably know already, and I'm worried about showing you this because I'm sure this is one of those things that you'll all say, I've heard about that, and that's just common sense. But I'm going to go for it anyway. I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact of students reviewing their own performance through video. So this is where you might video students doing a presentation and then analyze them after the fact. You're already nodding over there as if you've done this. Okay, so the idea of perhaps capturing a performance, it might be an artistic performance, or it might be something in nursing, these sorts of ideas. And just to get us started, has anybody in the room actually been recorded and then reviewed that in a kind of academic way or in a critical way? Oh, got a few hands up? Yeah, so this is quite a common practice. Was that in teaching? Anybody want to talk about that?
Yes, so we've quite often recorded part of a peer observation process where we reviewed and recorded lectures, and we were able to use them to look at our own practice.
So you analysed your own practice during that process, and did you find that useful or not? Hugely useful, yeah. So I'm interested in this. Ooh, go on, play.
Click off the lecture capture thing. Sorry, I've done that twice today.
Okay.
There you go.
Yeah. So I'm from John Moores University. We've got about 24,000 students. Many of those students are locally based. Some of those students have come from quite underprivileged backgrounds, lots of BTEC students, these sorts of things. And perhaps in some cases they have quite, they're the first person from their family going to university, they're quite unconfident, and possibly have difficulty transitioning into university and also into the workplace, into understanding their own position within a particular profession. We run lots of professional programs around nursing, teaching, these sorts of activities where students are, as well as learning academic skills and critical skills, they're also learning quite physical skills of presenting information, of talking, of communicating. And in our university, we have Panopto, we've had it for about 3 years. We don't have an opt-out, we have an opt-in policy, something similar to Surrey. And take-up's been quite mixed in terms of the lecture capture thing, but as many of you probably done, we did the evaluation after about 2 years, and I found those sorts of patterns of people trying very different, quite innovative things. But one of the largest things that people seem to have been doing, academics seem to be doing, was videoing students' performances, principally their presentations. But interestingly as well, they weren't sharing those recordings with the students. They were just going through all that agony of recording, setting up their camera, recording everything, was simply for, just in case the student was, wanted to double check whether the mark was right or whether the external examiner had a problem with that. And I was thinking, all that captured learning, hours and hours of it, and nobody seemed to be benefiting from it. So I hooked up with a lecturer in law who was sharing back something back to the students, their own recordings. And I'll talk a little bit about that project in a minute. In the review, I came across this work by Witten. Wolverhampton did a big review, and this is their paper about it. And they came up with this model around lecture capture and the value of lecture capture. So it's kind of a theoretical model, but they put lecture capture as you can do this at high volume, as we've all been learning today, but is it really adding a lot of learning value back to the students? Their gold standard in this model is the flipped classroom, where we were hearing from Louise and these sorts of things, where we're beginning to explore that perhaps more widely. But then you've got lots of other little pockets of ideas as well. What's not on there is this idea of students being recorded and then reviewing their own work. And I should think it's probably somewhere about here that it does give high learning value, as we'll explore in the literature in a moment, but it's probably not deliverable at scale. So here's the main slide of this is what the literature says. This 2001 paper was a big meta study of everything that had come previously, and this research goes all the way back to the very first beginnings of VHS recordings, and in 1963, Stanford University did the first study that looked at this particular idea, and actually their model has basically just followed on throughout the literature since that point. They recorded student teachers giving a mini presentation. They recorded that, and then together with peers, they sort of analyzed it. What this study does is it's looking at all the it's doing a meta-analysis of all the experimental studies. As Louise was saying, there's a sort of frustration about lecture capture where we can't really do a very scientific investigation. This paper found 33 studies which did pre and post tests and did the sort of experimental design to find that out. And they found very significant effects of skill acquisition, particularly around communication skills. And that's where that meta study was actually looking to find. So there's a huge benefit here in terms of learning. But also, the students were coming out with much more positive attitudes to their subject as well. This also, quite interestingly, had a positive effect at all academic levels. So they looked at the polished professional as well as the new undergraduate student. And they found the effect just as strong. As you were saying, you know, you're a seasoned professional, but you still got a lot from... All right, I'll stop with the smoozing. But, so there's a lot of benefit there from across the whole range. And there also seems to be no negative effect from this presence of a camera as well. People do tend to get worried about that. But I am going to explore in a minute what it's like to actually feel to watch yourself back, which can be quite problematic. So reviewing the literature, there's lots of different areas in terms of subject areas being explored. The majority of this is around public speaking, presentation skills, communication skills, lots of really interesting studies in the medical area, as you can imagine in teaching practice, but also little studies appearing in other subject areas as well. And then I've hived this little section off because there's also a sort of look at communication skills, but also kind of physical activities, like in nursing you might put in a catheter or something like that, and you might record that. So there's some really interesting ones in terms of police. It's very big in sports science for analysing athletic ability and these sorts of things, and also in dance. But I can imagine, if you think about the importance of communication skills within employability and these sorts of things, that you could easily lengthen that list to include the majority of subjects at university. What's been observed? Well, looking at the studies around those communication skills, probably people are quite familiar with lists like this of what's being said, how it's being said, the body language, the open questioning, making sure that you can explain things in a comprehensible way, and also being able to gather information from other people, kind of involve those other people in sharing their understanding. And what's encouraging about this literature as well is it's framed within a very sophisticated understanding of pedagogy and pedagogical theory. So many papers link this to experiential learning, and I would argue that you can go backwards there to Vygotsky. This is very easy to connect with these sorts of theorists. And also sideways to Engerstrom, where he's exploring the idea of belonging and of crossing over borders to become that professional, moving towards that area. And it links also to a lot of in-depth studies around the beneficial effects of feedback. I mean, what could be more of a way of feeding back to students than to actually see themselves undertaking something? So the way that they can understand their own performance and measure it against an ideal, and the way that this can cycle. Many of the studies in this area do this process more than once. So you won't be recording your presentation and then never revisiting that process again. You'll be recorded later on so that you can see the difference. And a nice theoretical kind of framework is one from Manwaring and Kovacs, which is the idea of re-seeing, of looking at video in terms of a mirror or a window into our understanding. However, it's not always working out fantastically. So there is highlights from particular studies where it has a negative effect. It can lower confidence. So what's discussed in the 2011 paper is ways in which what hasn't developed yet by 2011 was this very sophisticated way in which lecturers can engage students in this process. So here we're getting more studies where they're testing different ways of working with students, again in an experimental way, to say, well, if we produce a video as a benchmark, does that help students understand the difference? And it does. Does debriefing really help? And does peer review, having another student involved as well, help? And they do. Allowing students to see a criteria and practice using that criteria before they're asked to do it. These are both beneficial. And repeating that process, which many studies do. So there is gathering evidence of, yeah, it can have a beneficial effect, but you can amplify that beneficial effect simply by just molding the way that you do it. So in my own little bit of research, I was interested in how these students, they were law students, and they had a particular assessment where they had to interview an actor who was playing the role of somebody who had come in with a dispute about a will. And they had to ask certain questions, write down certain things. And in that process, they had 3 goes at it. They had the final assessment, which was videoed but not shared with them, and then 2 attempts before that where they just worked with a fellow student through a scenario and they were recorded. And then a few days after each one of those trial recordings, they met with the lecturer to discuss it. And that discussion was also done with a peer in the room as well. On top of this, they did get a chance to see the lecturer doing an example of this, not making any mistakes or anything like that, as an exemplar performance. And obviously they're doing this more than once. They had a criteria in which the lecturer was going to take them through their reviews. So this idea of watching yourself, I mean, going back to your experience, did you find it uncomfortable to watch yourself on video?
Hearing yourself is the first thing.
Yeah.
And then obviously watching yourself, your mannerisms and your mistakes is quite challenging.
Yeah. Because we all hear ourselves very differently inside our heads to how other people perceive us. And also, getting used to what we look like. Here's, I interviewed a number of students and asked them questions around this. So here we've got one. Yeah, it was awful. I think the first thing that you notice was the camera angles. They're very unflattering, and it's a good job no one else sees these. The cameras are quite high up. It's also nervous hearing your own voice and seeing yourself almost perform. But it was good. It's all self-reflection. It's all you need to be able to assess yourself and find out where you're going wrong. So it's almost like you're giving all the tools that they need to understand their own performance. Now, these students were self-selecting, so they're probably the better students. So I'm imagining that this was a fairly good student here who could understand that. Here's another one about the sort of perception of performance. What seemed to be difficult for students is if their performance that they've been recorded on was bad, and they sort of then just overcompensated and just saw that everything about this performance would be terrible, and they didn't want to look at it. So the first one I watched all the way through because I thought it was okay, and I just wanted to see. The second one, I had mixed up some advice I had given, so I wanted to skip through and not watch it. So that awkward sort of thing, oh God, where I did that thing, and I hate seeing myself do that thing, so I'm just going to avoid it. I did watch it just before I had my feedback session with a tutor, just to see what the tutor was going to pick up on. But when I watched it back, I actually realized it wasn't as bad as I thought it had gone. So there's that build-up of anxiety within the student of going, I know this was bad. And I feel this myself. I'm feeling it right now under pressure. I'm never going to watch this recording, by the way. But I feel it now. You know, you can feel that anxiety building up for that student. But then actually when you go through that difficult process of just getting over that initial hurdle, you start to realize and get a different opinion of yourself. A more sort of true understanding of what happened in some ways, although you could argue about whether that's true or not. So I want to link this back to this idea of professional persona. I was interested, because going all the way back to the beginning of this presentation, I was interested in the students and whether they were changing their attitude towards themselves and seeing themselves as slightly more professional by the fact that they were seeing themselves there perform this role and go, yeah, I'm not too bad actually, I could be a lawyer. So here's just a little snippet of something. I didn't find a lot of convincing material within the thing, but I just wanted to share you this. They had to say something, someone was dead, and we had to say something like, I'm sorry to hear that. Which you say in normal life, but in that situation, it was something I had to remember to say, because I would just say, okay, yeah. I think I did say that on my first one. And when I listened back, I was thinking, that sounds horrible. So I'm thinking there that possibly the student is seeing themselves portrayed as this performance of being a lawyer and thinking, almost like as out-of-body experience of saying, well, yeah, they were awful, weren't they? And I'm not going to make that mistake again. And you see that in the literature as well, this kind of realization of their mistakes, and then the quite powerful impact that it has in terms of changing their attitude. Just another one, like, do not do that. Be more formal. Like how a solicitor acts, you know, sort of self-criticism of themselves when they're watching it, just go, just don't do that, you know, I can see I'm going wrong and where that is. Anyway, I'm going to carry on looking at this area and exploring how we can do this. But I think it's interesting bringing this presentation to this lecture capture one, and why I was interested in doing this, because unfortunately, in the sort of maelstrom of discussion around lecture capture, I wonder if sometimes we're missing or we've overwritten some of the fantastic things that you can do with video. And that the companies that we're working with who are selling these solutions are focused, because we're focused on this type of solution of recording what's happening in the classroom. Whereas a lot harder, I don't know whether people have tried this, to try and set up a lecture capture system for students to use to record themselves. It's not really built very well for that. And also, it's not very well built for tutors then to be able to review those recordings, because it's not usually used in that way. And I know there are tools out there, but I don't really want to add another tool to our toolkit just to solve this particular problem. So it'd be interesting to try and work with companies to try and get them to just realize that there are other uses for this. I'm interested in this because we've got a new building that's coming on stream in about 12 months, and the libraries have got a small section of that building, and I've asked for 2 small recording suites to be made to allow students to go in and practice as groups in there and make these recordings. And I wonder whether providing solutions will help students then not just practice, but also gain a little bit more confidence, because they'll be able to watch themselves and then use some tools to analyze that. But I do have to be careful. I am aware that I could be setting students up to create a kind of anxiety cycle around this, where they practice this and then get het up on the minutiae of their recording, what I sound like, what I'm wearing, you know, rather than perhaps the things that are actually going to help them. So it might be difficult to bring that on stream and make it very successful. We are doing a lot more recording as well in the area of nursing. So I'm sure many of your universities that are looking at nursing are using much more simulation, and the way that that's going to be recorded and reviewed, which could be another powerful example of this used in other places. But it does raise the question as well, going right back to your point at the beginning, is we're making all these recordings, and I'm sure you've thought about this, everybody that's instigated lecture capture, is why aren't the lecturers watching them back and learning from them? And how do we help them to do that without scaring the living daylights out of them? Because as we saw before, they're really worried about being monitored and this being used as formal reviews. But actually, going back to those results, it's very clear, particularly from the area of teaching and learning, that this is the major way in which you learn how to be a better teacher. So, I don't know whether anybody's interested in joining in on a little bit sort of research into this area and trying to get something brewing around this, but that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.